Professor Christopher Pinney. We've been talking about getting together, and for him to come to Chobimela for quite some time now. It's finally happened, so I'm very happy that it has happened. But he brings a different dimension to what we're doing here. One of the things we've not sufficiently done is look at photography from a cultural perspective, from an anthropological perspective, and Christopher does specifically that. His geographic location has largely been in India, though by no means does he restrict his practice to photography alone, but photography practice, particularly vernacular photography practice, is something that has been very much his domain. He's with University College London. His coming book, Straight from Hell, is that right? Lessons from Hell is about to come out. I'm not going to do a lot of talking here. We have Christopher himself, but once Christopher has spoken, we actually have someone else who I think would be far better than me in terms of engaging with him and mediating between him and the audience. His student, a Bangladeshi, Zirwat Chaudhary. So once Christopher has spoken, Zirwat will come along, and then we will have a discussion. So please welcome Dr. Christopher Pinney.
Thank you very much, Shahidul, for that kind introduction. It's really wonderful to finally be here at this legendary event, and thank you all very much for coming. I hope that some of you will have seen a film, Once Upon a Time in Mumbai, with Ajay Devgan, which mobilizes an aesthetics of nostalgia about the 1970s and 80s. And so one of the things I want to think about is the passing of time, constructions of history, how we might read those photographically, filmically, aesthetically. So let me, before I move on, and I understand that I'm going to talk for no more than 40 minutes, and someone's going to wave at me from the audience once my time is up. So don't let me go on too long, please. Before I move on to the body of work, the archive, very specific, and we might say claustrophobic archive of images from the late 1970s and 80s that I want to try and think about today. I want to say something a bit more broadly about the studio and the setting from which they come. The studio is called Studio Suhag. It's located in central India, in Madhya Pradesh, about exactly halfway between Delhi and Mumbai. And some of its work may be familiar from an earlier publication of mine, Camera Indica. And that book focused very much on the kinds of images that consumers engage. The printed image that the studio produces for the paying customer. And these were often marked by very ingenious and sophisticated techniques of double printing, of montage, much of which often also involve quite a complex iconography that could be decoded and read in terms of local aesthetic and mythic expectations. And I want to say that this studio still thrives today. It's, as its slogan says above the shop, top in town in Nagda, Madhya Pradesh. Although all its images produce now are colour photoshopped prints of the kind we see here. What I want to talk about, however, is a large collection of medium format negatives recently salvaged from this studio's go-down as a result of a particular event, which was the influx of a lot of monsoon water 3 years ago, which dislodged an immaculately filed archive of maybe 30 or 40,000 prints and transform them into a mouldering mush on the floor. Here you see a mix of medium format and later 35mm negs. And what I'm talking about today is the 2,000 or 3,000 medium format negs from the late 1970s that we've been able to salvage from this very large pile on the floor. And I want to try and think about some of the issues that this very particular, we might say, isolated archive raises. And I wanted to start by thinking about the question of the kind of history that might get narrated by this archive. So that at one level it's a set of negative images that come out of a tumultuous period of Indian history, the end of the emergency through to the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So one might go to this archive expecting that they'll be seared by their times. And I want to start by suggesting that actually one of the most striking things about them is that whatever their time is, it isn't the time of the nation. So there are some images, such as portraits of patriotic NCC cadets, which perhaps do speak to that late 1970s moment in India. There are other images in which photography, as is often the case, operates as a kind of lingua franca of modernity, where we see people experimenting with newly available technologies, so that films and radios, not necessarily connected to any apparatus of distribution, were kept as props in the studio for customers to mobilize in their own portraiture endeavors. So, of course, there are certain things we can say about the way in which these negatives are situated in a particular historical moment. But by and large, that historical moment seems to be one that's inflected by a set of fantasies that come out of a broader mediascape, and perhaps especially out of popular film. So its history, I want to suggest, is not first and foremost a history of the nation. This claustrophobic space of the studio seems to provide evidence certainly of transformations, of aspirations and dreams, but they're aspirations and dreams that seem to be being generated out of Mumbai rather than events in Delhi or the nation more generally. And of course, we can also trace a history of change, a history of a moment in terms of the material culture that's on display, either in terms of the length of lapels or alternatively particular textile styles, the width of bell bottoms on trousers, which very much speak to a particular historical moment, many of which are also informed by that filmy imagination. So popular cinema seems to be one of the main conduits that's impacting into this tiny 8x10 space in the middle of central India. We also see some evidence in this collection, this archive of 2,000 or 3,000 negatives, of what one might call a vernacular modernism. So there's also a self-fashioning, about which I'll say a good deal more in just a moment, which I think is very much engaged with the question of changing times, of a history in flux. People clearly imagine themselves in particular identity positions which have a particular kind of relationship to the flow of time. However, I want to suggest that the most interesting thing about this collection as an archive is not that kind of history, temporality, or historicity, but rather what we might call the doubled history of the images in the archive themselves. So the images themselves bear a surface testimony to a changing temporality. They're many of them overlain with very striking surface marks which record a history subsequent to the exposure of those images, a history of decay. This is perhaps the point at which these images might connect with the theme of fragility the dominant theme of the current Chobi Mela. And one of the things I want to flag up here is sort of, I was going to say of course, but I mean I think it's certainly the fact that what might interest us as photography professionals or cultural critics about this secondary history, this history of decay subsequent to the exposure of the negative, is an effect which from the point of view of local consumers is read simply as a defect, as a lack. And I'll return to that theme later of this conflict between an archival and curatorial set of concerns and the concerns of the commercial customers of this studio. So images such as these, which might evoke in us pleasing Brechtian responses from the point of view of the customers in this small town, are merely defective. Okay, in this archive of about 2,000 to 3,000 images, there are quite a few external, largely rural, village-based wedding photographs. Suag refers to the auspicious state of being married, so that weddings are a huge part of the income stream, have always been a huge part of the income stream of this studio. But there's just one image taken directly from the steps of the studio out into the street outside, which we see here. And I think that one image then points us back to the hugely important fact that the overwhelming majority of the images all describe this extraordinary, peculiar, claustrophobic space inside the studio, a space of 8 by 10 feet, a space which, as you go through several thousand of these images, you start to feel you know intimately well. You know the position of painted pillars, painted backdrops, the moment at which different backdrops are transposed and transformed. This image here, which in conversation with the proprietor of the studio and the photographer responsible for all these images, Suresh Punjabi, points us to the question of the relationship to the camera. One of the things that interests me very much about this archive as a corpus is their continual reinscription of the space of the making of the photograph. The studio as this claustrophobic theatrical zone in which all activity is oriented towards this apparatus that stares the customer in the face. And Suresh Punjabi, the photographer, noted that I was going to say very often, that would be a slight exaggeration, but it was often the case that customers would present themselves in such a way to the camera as though they were engaging an object or force with potential divine powers. This makes me think of an argument that Jacques Derrida makes at the beginning of his book Archive Fever, about the ways in which one aspect of the archive needs to be thought about in terms of the way in which it becomes part of the presence of God, part of the commandement to the subjects of the archive. And we can perhaps see evidence of that here in the reflex response by many subjects towards the camera as they seek the blessing of the apparatus and its operator in making an ideal image. And one can perhaps see other signs of this peculiar divine and haphazard presence in a series of accidental double exposures that suggests that this also becomes a space for the unexpected. This claustrophobic space dominated by apparatus is not a space entirely under the control of the photographer. Okay, one of the things I'd like to explore now is the kind of frame in which one might interpret this body of work, this archive. Here we see Suresh Punjabi narrating, contextualizing, ethnographizing this archive in which he, because of the passing of time, had little interest, and although I should say that his interest has been very much reawakened by this project. So one of the ways in which one might approach this archive is to contextualize it, to put a set of cultural frames around it, to anthropologize it. We might also think that an alternative to that might be to treat these images as a cache of the work of an undiscovered master of photography whom we might want to elevate to the status of someone like Shahidul Keita or Malik Sidibe. So the distinction, the choice there might be between, on the one hand, the contextualizing ethnographic strategy, on the other hand, a decontextualizing aesthetic art discourse strategy. What I want to explore in the time that remains is a third alternative, which I think is best described by Sharat Maharaj as a tactic of what he calls xenoepistemics, and which I want to suggest uses the archive as a means of investigating and contributing to photographic theory. So I want to chart a path between what, in many contexts, I think are often presented as two sole alternatives. So in that context, let me run you through a possible ethnographic set of contextualizations, which I then want to distance myself from. So these would be broadly anthropological and historical. And they would provide perhaps a ready set of classifications through which we might start to determine pathways and a kind of sense of order through this heterogeneous mass of materials. So a first obvious way of doing this would be to focus on the question of what's sometimes being called instrumental realism. A lot of these images are taken for bank loan form applications, for season tickets, for medical insurance claims. They engage the face in its visibility in some way to the demands of the state. But as I hope you'll see, there are also images which I think very quickly, precisely because of their aesthetic and, for want of a better term, auratic quality, also serve to transcend that distinction. But nevertheless, we might want to say that a certain number of these images are portraits produced in the instrumental realist mode. But the line between instrumental and what is sometimes called sentimental realism, i.e. Images produced for one's own or family portraiture purposes, quickly erodes. There are a good number of images whose precise classificatory position is rather difficult to determine. Another way of ethnographizing might then be to say, well, as the name Suag suggests, the auspicious state of being married, the work of these small town studios, and this small town studio in particular, is very closely linked to rite de passage, to life cycle rites. Weddings, obviously, and weddings from different communities. And there's a story to be told there about the ways in which different communities mobilize the camera in different kinds of spaces. So Christian couples habitually would come to have a limited number of studio portraits made following a marriage, whereas Hindu brides and grooms would be photographed in situ in the context of the wedding celebration. There's also then a very important allied industry, portraiture industry, related to the production of seductive and appealing portraits of prospective brides and grooms. And here the art of the photographer involves portraying these faces and bodies in the most flattering and alluring way possible. So continuing that ethnographizing trajectory, we might also then want to say, well, what we also find evidence of in this archive is a whole set of different community practices, oriented around different ritual events and trajectories. So we might want to start to map out a sociological terrain here, involving different communities, different festivals, the different timing of this. So from Eid to Rakhi, Raksha Bandhan, to the month of Shravan, during which many male Hindus do not shave, and on the day before they shave, at the end of the month, will then visit the studio with their beard before it disappears. And then Diwali, a period in which friends and family come in huge droves into the studio to mark relationships, sociality, which at this time of year are imbued with a particular sense of auspiciousness. So what I'm trying to suggest is there is a kind of ready-to-hand ethnographic cultural narrative that one could very easily lay over these images. We're not dealing here simply with images of single people or groups. There is another kind of narrative which, if our end goal was essentially ethnological, ethnographic rather, or cultural, we would want to stress. In the same way, we might then point to the role of costume, people's everyday and work costume, how that relates to occupation. If one is a porter or a coolie or a policeman or a band master, or you live in a village and you imagine yourself to be a muscular, virile Thakur who wants to make a certain claim to hierarchical status by brandishing your gun. So all these images can certainly be read sociologically, ethnographically. They can have a cultural frame put around them. There would then also be a question of demographics. One could imagine a study which asked about the frequency of visits by different members of different communities. In the same way, one could also imagine an inquiry which focused on the urban versus the rural. Some images seem to recall a very marked urban form of conjugality of the kind one is very unlikely to see in a village setting. So what one sees happening in this extraordinary confined space of the studio is a continual procession of different demographics. And that, of course, might be one way to proceed, one way to structure the archive and narrate a story about that archive. So this is continuing the rural theme. So it's often said by studio proprietors in this town, it's a joke you hear again and again. I'm suggesting that the evidence of this and the next image refute the veracity of this, that if a peasant, a cultivator, a kisan log comes into your studio and demands a full body pose, and you present them with a half or quarter pose, they will refuse to pay the full fee. They will say that only half of me has come out. I'm only going to pay you half the fee. But as we see here, there are lots of images of rural cultivators which seem to contravene this rule. And this image is perhaps particularly striking because of the disjuncture between the rural subjects and the self-consciously modernist backdrop, which features from the early 80s in quite a few of these images. One could also approach the question of aesthetics, portraiture aesthetics, in terms of class and in terms of the rural and the urban. So another narrative that is very strongly propounded by studio proprietors is that villagers abhor shadow. What is called light and dark shooting is the peculiar predilection of a very small, very sophisticated urban elite. By and large, most people are anxious about the presence of shadow. All these negatives are very heavily retouched after exposure to minimize shadow. And as Suresh Punjabi, the photographer, was very keen to point out to me, it's particularly shadow under the chin which causes anxiety. So hence this genre of images, of which there are many, in which subjects seem to automatically attempt to cover their chin to fend off this threatening darkness. So I touched earlier on the question of instrumental realism and sentimental realism. I want to think now about the question of sentimental realism in relation to a more theatrical style of portraiture, which is also a dominant element in this archive of images. So the studio kept a number of props, dresses, jewelry, hats, plastic grapes, various items which were available for customers to use in their theatrical presentation of the self. This, in fact, is the customer's own live parrot. So it's not an example of a studio prop, but it's perhaps a good example of that theatrical presentation of self. And of course, many of these also bear the influence of that filmic trajectory. Commercial Bombay cinema is here leaving its impact in the way people imagine themselves and the way in which they deploy themselves in front of the camera. And one of the points I want to make here very briefly is that the idiom that customers use in relation to this kind of theatrical portraiture relates to their desire, as the photographers say, to come out better. There's a very explicit understanding that the potential and the attraction of this extraordinary claustrophobic space of the studio, this space where you present yourself in intimate proximity to the apparatus of the camera, is that it will produce a record of whatever is present in the moment of exposure. And I think that what people in this small town have very clearly theorized is precisely the point that Roland Barthes makes in Camera Lucida, when he makes the distinction between the body, the core of the photographic event, and the corpus, which is the general truth that we expect photography to provide. And I think people's fascination with the theatrical possibilities of the moment of photographic exposure is underscoring their faith in the body of the event. They understand that this precisely is the power of the photograph. It doesn't have to speak to any normalizing, generalizing historical or psychological truth. What it provides is a trace of an event, and what matters is how you stage that event. And I think that's one of the frames through which we can think about then what this archive, I think, allows us to do theoretically. This image, I think, is particularly fascinating because we see hanging on the left-hand side of this standing figure 2 strips of medium format negs drying. And they're there because the customer wants a full-body print of himself in portrait format. Because of the mechanics of the medium format, the photographer Suresh Punjabi, in order to fit the full body into the frame of the negative, has to move backwards, and in so doing, and this is the constraints, we could say almost the Kittlerian, here I allude to the work of the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler, the Kittlerian constraints of the medium format negative, which as he moves backwards will inevitably incorporate all this noise and clutter of the studio. So that what we find is in the negative archive, there is a different deposition of evidence to what we see in the final print. So that the task of printing then essentially becomes a work of selection and reduction, in which that background noise is all deliberately eliminated. It's of no interest to the paying customer. It's an accidental byproduct of the practice of this apparatus. And it's precisely that question which interests me much more than any attempt to simply ethnographize or historicize these images, to contextualize them. I'm interested in what these images then tell us about the photographic event. I'm interested in what Friedrich Kittler would call the noise of the photograph, the random data inscriptions, which after all are what make photography different from most other media. So coming back to the question of the archive, what we're confronted with here is a very particular kind of space repeated again and again, the space determined by medium format negatives, which necessarily include a lot of noise, accidental noise. And we could think about this in terms of that great quote from Walter Benjamin, writing in Little History of Photography, where he says, no matter how hard the photographer tries to arrange things, no matter how hard the photographer tries to exclude, the photograph is always, so he says, seared with the real, that it ends up transmitting tiny sparks of contingency, which nestle in the photograph and remain available for future readers. And for me, these images, these negatives, so the negative dimension of this is important to stress, become interesting precisely for the ways in which they illuminate that dimension of photographic theory. So this space becomes rather consequential in terms of that theory. And this is where I'd want to suggest that we can escape that initial dichotomy that I pointed towards between, on the one hand, an ethnographic contextualization of these images, how do we anthropologize them, or its seeming obverse, which is how do we place them in the zone of the transcendent, the ahistorical, the asocial? How do we try and turn Suresh Punjabi into a figure like Saidu Keita? What I'd like to suggest is that the space of the studio itself, which is documented as a kind of secret, hidden margin in these negatives, and which would never have come to light were it not for the fact that this monsoon rain had deluged the photographer's go-down and churned his ordered archive into this mouldering mush. Those hidden secret margins of the negative archive provide a space for thinking photographically and theoretically. And what I also want to suggest is that they allow us to get out of the possible trap of a certain kind of cultural ghettoization. So it strikes me that one of the main tasks for anyone working on non-Euro-American photography is to avoid presenting the photography that they happen to be working on as simply a kind of limiting case or special case which footnotes a modular Euro-American practice of photography. So it seems very clear to me that almost any history of photography you pick up, I think there are two exceptions to this, but there are probably 150 other examples that are not exceptions. Almost any history of photography you pick up will be a history of photography in Europe and America. It will be a history of photography that assumes that the theoretical innovations and debates are most usefully foregrounded in cultural production from those regions. And inasmuch as photography from other regions interrupts that narrative, it tends to do so as what Roland Barthes would call a nominated footnote. So Roland Barthes made an argument about ex-nomination. He was speaking about the bourgeoisie, which is so dominant that it doesn't have to draw attention to itself. So one could make the argument about US URLs precisely don't require a .us because of their power within that global system. That is an example of X-nomination. Everywhere else is nominated, located, specified, and ultimately ghettoized. And I think that's what happens when we talk about Indian photography, Japanese photography, Peruvian photography. If we look at the historiography of photographic practice in those regions, they tend to present what's happening there as a nominated footnote to a global X-nominated, or putatively global X-nominated Euro-American history. And I think that by studying archives such as this and by interrogating vernacular studio practices, by attending to the hidden margins that subsist in this case in the negative incarnations of these images, we're able to try and do something theoretically consequential. We can engage those debates about the nature of the photographic event. It's Benjamin and Kittler, among others, who seem to speak very directly to these images. And these images seem to illuminate those theoretical debates, as also do art practices. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So one of the consequences of this argument is that the space that interests me in this archive is precisely that square of the medium format negative, with its noise hidden in the margins. It's that which makes it, I think, a kind of violence, really, to extract the fascinating, beautiful details from these negatives. We need to preserve the integrity of this space of the event, these negatives as traces of an event, of a happening. What I'd also just briefly add here is that I think this is a point at which one could make an argument about the spatiality of this archive rather than the temporality of the archive, which is very dominant in Derrida's discussion in Archive Fever. That discussion is subtitled A Freudian Impression. He's interested in the Freudian mystic writing pad. His metaphor is essentially temporal and is one of deposition. He's interested in the archive as a process of settling, of sedimentation through time. It strikes me that these images, as part of an archive, are about spatiality and instantaneity. They're about what Benjamin called the flash of recognition. So I think there's also, if we had time, an argument to be made here about this as a spatial archive, the archive of endlessly repeated events for which it doesn't ultimately make sense to try and construct a conventional history. So then let me also say that what I've tried to do here, albeit in a very compressed way, is suggest that this archive of studio practice is telling us something about what Sharat Maharaj calls xenoepistemics, by which he means materially embodied aesthetic practices rigged out for conducting difference that disrupt or can disrupt conventional narratives, in the same way that I think vernacular studio practices anywhere can, if we attempt to read them imaginatively. It's precisely the relationship of space, event, and apparatus that is configured and configures all these images. So the question ultimately of, whether we want to put Suresh Punjabi alongside Malik Sidibe, or whether he's more like Mama Kasset or Sakale, I think is a false kind of question. That's not the most interesting question to be asking. Let me also note, just as a penultimate point before I finish, that I think, or I should stress that and this would be very much in the spirit of xenoepistemics, My thinking about the studio as a space has very much been triggered by looking at Pushpamala N's artwork. It strikes me that a lot of her work is concerned precisely with the claustrophobic dimensions of the studio, and this as a space for staging an event. And that theme, implicit in her Bombay Photo Studio series, I think is made absolutely explicit in what she terms with Claire Arney the process series from native women of South India. And what I think she does here visually is absolutely explicitly demarcate the pro-filmic space of the studio, of the photographic event, here by framing it with a kind of extraneous margin of the kind that I've been trying to draw attention to in the context of Studio Suhag's work. So, final point. What I've tried to stress is I think this negative archive then has, I hope, significance and interest because it provides one way of feeding in to a general photographic debate, one which gets us out of regional neo-Orientalist ghettoizations of photography as cultural practice. I think it allows us to do something different with photography. So in that sense, I'm pretty much uninterested in this project in emulating what in other contexts I think is undoubtedly completely admirable work, such as that of the Indian Memory Archive, run out of Bombay, the Indian Memory Project run out of Bombay, which is an attempt to recuperate an archive, a haphazardly self-selecting archive of images, through annotating them with personal histories. And in that light, I would, and this is the final slide, add that some of these images which we've recuperated in negative form are still displayed as part of the social space of this small town. So they still live on in their printed form. And I think that there would undoubtedly be an interesting project that could be conducted, which would involve working with the people who are the subjects of these photographs, gathering and narrating their histories. So here we see Wasim Khan, the bandmaster who appeared in an image I showed you, the negative, scanned negative version of earlier. But what I'd like to stress is I think, although highly worthwhile, that would be a completely different project from the one I've been trying to advocate here. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you for that wonderful talk. I just have a few cursory remarks from jotting down notes right now. But what struck me towards the end of your talk is that the shift from spatiality to temporality that you suggest is actually a very Freudian move, because you're almost returning it to the unheimlich, which is the uncanny, and what it actually represents is the unhomely. So it's kind of returning it to a spatiality again, rather than kind of this recourse to a temporality. But that said, I would ask you to explain a little more this distinction between instantaneity and spatiality, because to me, as an art historian, when I think of instantaneity, that's a very temporal move. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that. The other question I have is that given what you're doing with this project, or this archive, I was struck by your repeated use of vernacular, because that seemed to take recourse, again, to what you're trying to deny with the goal of your project itself, in terms of kind of devising a broader photographic theory of what can be done with these kinds of these negatives. And finally, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether it's possible to also return the photographer to the photographic event here. The photograph of Pushpamala N that you showed us obviously returns the event as, I mean, she's both model and participant in that, and performer. But as somebody who works on the medium of painting in particular, the portrait event is very much about the sitter and the artist. And obviously with photography, I understand the importance placed on the apparatus, as you say. But I was wondering, I mean, it seemed to me a bit of a disjunction between your references to Suresh Punjabi, the photographer, versus the photographic event being one where there isn't as much of an acknowledgement of the photographer himself. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about these three things, and then we can open up the floor for discussion.
Sure. Thank you. Am I audible with this? Audible or not? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, on vernacularity, I mean, I think my position would be that everything is vernacular, but some things also get elevated into other registers as well. So, you know, this is a vernacular practice which so far has not been elevated into other registers. Maybe it will. I mean, I tried to suggest towards the end that there are certain registers into whose appropriation of this would not, I think, necessarily advance matters other than for the individual photographer, which, you know, may in itself be grounds for switching registers. So I understand absolutely there's a often made argument about the kind of the trap of the vernacular, that in appealing to the vernacular one ends up reinscribing that very set of elite practices from which one's seeking escape. But as a kind of quasi-Derridian, I'd say, you know, we just have to live with that difficulty. So maybe this should be vernacularity erased, crossed out. To my mind, it's the best concept we have. Instantaneity, yeah, I mean, I think, of course, instantaneity itself is a temporal construct, possibility, event. I mean, what I was pointing at, perhaps in a rather obscure way, was really the sense in which I think the questions of spatiality that this archive generate place one in a space which is different from that which is generated by, to take one recent example, Derrida's discussion of the archive in Archive Fever. So there he's very much interested in what he calls the mark of the substrate, this idea of an impression which leaves a mark, which is a depression, which is essentially then related to the passing of time, and how that then echoes or resonates with that sense we have of archives as ideally being sedimenting processes in which things settle and then more recent things are deposited on top of them. So in my initial comments about history and the possibility or the desirability or undesirability of imposing a history on these images, what I wanted to suggest is that, you know, whilst one certainly could have a go at sedimenting these, as imposing the mark of the substrate, as Derrida would put it, I'm not sure how useful that is, because once one becomes familiar with these images, looking at you know, several thousand of them, what one's struck with time and time again is precisely the repetition of this space. It's a kind of insistent, endless duplication of this particular claustrophobic scenario caught in a moment. So yes, of course, there's an unavoidably temporal dimension to that. But I think what I was trying to point towards was the possibility that we might try and imagine archives spatially, so not as involving deposition over time, but as involving this kind of, you know, endless, almost fractal replication of a particular space. The space you see time and time again in these negatives. as to your final very interesting point, yes, of course, Pushpamala is very self-consciously and reflexively the subject of her own picture making. I mean, I suppose at one level that's not so clearly the case with these images. However, I think one can collapse the distance. So, I mean, having known Suresh Punjabi for 30 years now, when I look at these images, I always imagine him behind the apparatus, as he was behind the apparatus. And having been photographed by him numerous times, I also see in the pictures his presence. And one thing I perhaps ought to add is that his younger brother is deaf and dumb, and as a result he learns sign language. And so he has extraordinarily expressive hands. And so one of the peculiar pleasures, I mean, it's always a pleasure to be photographed in a small town Indian studio, but one of the peculiar, pleasures of being photographed by Suresh is that you feel you're almost being sculpted by him as a physical presence, precisely because of a sign language inflected set of gestures. And so that when you sit there with the lights and the camera, it's not, you know, it's as far removed from anonymous surveillance by photography as one could imagine. I mean, I've often thought of an alternative title for this project, as being camera consciousness. What I frequently see in these images, precisely that kind of incredible alertness and alacrity in these portraits. That at the moment of exposure, there's some extraordinary mutuality and intimacy in the relationship between Sita and Suresh sculpting his subjects, partly through his hand gestures, but also through, you know, his embodied presence in this extraordinarily tiny space. So I hope I've started to answer your interesting question.
Really useful because, I mean, Bas talks about, you know, the moment, at the moment of exposure, you have the sitter, you know, changing their comportement towards the camera. And this is almost a very different way of thinking about that moment, where it's not so much you change your posture with the camera as it is, you're actually trying to engage with, like you said, you're being sculpted as well.
Yeah.
Great.
No, well, I mean, if I could just add, I mean, yeah, so that would also be one of the ways in which I hope we could link this kind of archive into a broader discussion about photographic theory. So as you say, you know, Roland Barthes, I invent myself anew in front of the camera. Something happens fascinating in front of the camera. You know, what these images are documents of the event of people making themselves into something different for the camera in this space. Benjamin says exactly the same thing. It is a different nature that speaks to the camera than the eye. Something happens in front of the camera. And I think, you know, why I find these images so fascinating is because they seem to precisely visually crystallize that transformation.
Well, maybe we can take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure.
Or we can take this one.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One aspect that I'm particularly interested in, and so it's not really the marginality outside of the picture you have been alluding to, but the following question. Somebody from the village or from the town need a picture for whatever reason. He goes to a place which is clearly identified as the right place to go. If I'm sick, I go to the doctor. Okay, if I need a picture, I go to the photographer. So I go there. And I'm going to have, as I say, my picture taken. And my question is this, is that a product is going to be, is going to come out of this, is going to be produced, and what does it tell us about the individual and the social representation that people have of themselves? according to the time, because things change over time, according to the social strata I'm from, and so on and so forth. So what, you have been studying those many, many, many pictures. And, you started to allude at the end of this conversation about what you call the transformation. Is this really a transformation? Of course, I mean, everybody is different a little bit in front of the camera, but much more important, there is a background, and the background is that what images do I have of myself? What image, in fact, the society has of what is a good picture? Mm. And that's really what I would like to hear you maybe elaborate a little bit. What does it tell us about what the individual and the society have of what is a good picture? Good picture, a decent picture, an acceptable picture, a good picture.
Thank you. Well, I think one would need to start by differentiating between those who have either a single or a very small number of photographs taken, who tend to be from village backgrounds, and those more likely urban customers who may compile very extensive portfolios. So the elaborate theatrical posing is much more marked in wealthier clients who are able to continually visit the studio and pursue what's always described as a hobby, as a source of pleasure, that people derive unquestionable pleasure from exploring their possible incarnation in front of the camera. So I think one would probably want to say that the villager who goes for one photograph for a bank loan application for an irrigation pump has a different set of expectations from an urban 18-year-old female on her 25th visit who has some new clothes and jewellery that she wants to be photographed in. So there wouldn't be any single, simple answer. However, I think, just to perhaps respond in one way to this, I mean, I think that one of the most striking things about what many people in this town, or the way in which many people in this town talk about photography, is the striking dualism. So one of the things in my earlier research that I was very confused about was that the conventional anthropology of India stresses what's sometimes called a monism, the idea that the surface is a way of accessing the interior, so that interior sentiment and character should be visible through external forms. So this is kind of thing like a Benares Brahmin doesn't pass on dhan, their thumb will go green and drop off. You can tell a corrupt Brahmin because they'll have hand deformities, but it's a kind of stereotypical version of that monist argument. In this context, there was an absolutely fundamental dualism that was continually reasserted, that photography won't tell you anything about the character of an individual. And this is again where I would seek to fold this local practice into photographic theory, because I think what they're saying is exactly what Roland Barthes says when he says the photograph only delivers the body, the core. It will never deliver the corpus, because that's not a photographic question. The corpus, that thing which he says is attainable only by sampling, is something completely separate from photography. And in this dualist idiom, I think that people in this town say something very similar, which is what the photograph tells you is what happens when the photograph was made. It doesn't tell you anything about the character of the person. So people use these two terms, vyaktitva and charitra, for a kind of external personness as opposed to an interiorized character. And absolutely clear that character is essentially a narrative practice, which is only to be determined by observing people's deeds. So something surprising emerges out of this, which is that there isn't a dominant idea that one can somehow see people's sentiments or souls. there's a discourse of unreadability, which when I first started working on this issue was very striking. But there's a huge amount more to say because this is a complex demography. It's a very stratified society. People from villages have different expectations from town dwellers. There is also something like an emergent practice of what Bourdieu a long time ago called distinction. So there are very marked aesthetic differences, particularly relating to shadow and contrast. And of course the dissemination of cell phone cameras is now starting to change this landscape in quite dramatic ways.
We have more questions. One in the back over there. Yes? Yes, please.
I was curious why you were referring this studio as a claustrophobic space, because if we are going back to the Robert's argument or iteration, is that it's a space which is a liminal space, because it's a liminal zone, and from your presentation and from your photograph, what was evident is that this, yes, you can see the core, and you can't see the corpus of this characters. But this is the zone where different kind of magic is happening. This is a theatrical space. So, I mean, physically it can be very claustrophobic, but metaphorically probably it's not for them, and it gives you a different kind of ontological position that is represented there. I think, so I just wanted to know, I mean, why this specific reference is needed here.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's a very important observation. I'm there conflating my own experience of the space and the way in which the photographer has always spoken about it, with the way in which I think many of his customers imagine it quite differently, as you say, something much more expansive and filled with imaginary potential. But so I suppose in my defense I'd say that I always had ringing at the back of my head Marianne Hirsch's The Photograph, A Strange Confined Space, which is a kind of idiom I think about a lot in terms of then the negative as the trace of an event, in which what you see is kind of all the clutter in that confined space. But in Suresh's own narrative, he very much stresses claustrophobia. So quite apart from the physical smallness of the space, which is one is made aware of experientially again and again in working with the negatives. He also, Endersey talks about the analog days when he used to work all night in a little cubby hole, which was, so when you go into the front of the shop, the whole shop is probably about 18 feet by 10. The first 8 feet is then the front area, which now has 4 computers with Photoshop, but then used to have his desk, and then at a height of about 5 feet was a kind of 3.5-foot compartment, which was the studio in which he worked all night. So his tiny little ladder, he'd go up there and develop the negatives in there, crouched. I mean, so his narrative of the time of the making of these images is one of extraordinary physical containment and discomfort. So I suppose that's also informing my continual use of the claustrophobic idiom. But I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that I may be leading you astray if you then assume that this is also how customers perceive this space.